Okay, Rule 20, room to tack in an obstruction. So this is one of two places in the rules where a hail matters. There's only two spots in the rule book where a hail is required. The first is protest. If you're going to protest another boat, you have to hail the word protest. It is a must, it's a shall. That's the way the rule is written. It's not optional. In this case, when we talk about hailing for room at an obstruction, we'll talk about the required hail that goes on here as well. There's a required response also. So a hail and then a response are required as part of this rule. You can pass that hail on to an additional boat, and the rule speaks to that. And it uses extensively the definitions of room and the definition of what an obstruction is. So let's take a look at a real example here. Okay, here's two boats coming into a shore. We see this all the time on inland lakes. All right. Blue asks for room to tack. Okay, the required hail is by yellow saying you tack. So essentially what yellow is doing is acknowledging that blue is asked to tack, and yellow is still keeping its options open. But it's required to hail you tack. Once it does...
Required to tack immediately or hail you tack.
Yes.
And
yes.
thereafter keep clear.
Yeah, thank you. So let's go back to the scenario as this is unfolding. Yellow either has to tack immediately or hail you tack. If they hail you tack, then now they have an option where they could go ahead and duck them and get further into the obstruction if tactically that's what they wanted to do.
Or they can wait for blue to start their tack and then tack with them.
They can also tack with them even if they hail you tack. They can tack to leeward of them. So here's the scenario with port boats and a starboard right-of-way boat. It's basically the same thing, right? In this case, blue asks for room to tack. Green hails you tack and then goes ahead and tacks underneath them. And then if you note, gray bails out and ducks it all. Okay? Perfectly acceptable. Room to tack in an obstruction is also covered in the appeal and case book. Appeal 15 in particular says a boat's permitted to hail another for room to tack when a substantial course change is required for her to avoid an obstruction. This particular case had to do with, that's actually a 50-foot police launch servicing a capsized boat. They're an obstruction. So it's perfectly acceptable to do that and supported by this case. Another case has to deal with if a boat hails for room to tack when she's neither approaching an obstruction nor sailing close hauled or above, you actually break 20.1. So if there isn't an obstruction and you hail for room to tack, you've broken 20.1.
But Rick, is the windward boat still required to respond?
The windward boat is still required to respond even though the leeward boat breaks it. So doing nothing is not an option. You can't just plow into them. You can't ignore it. You do have to act even though the other boat broke the rule.
So where would that be important that you're going upwind on starboard and somebody says room to tack in a really hurried voice and you have no idea why? Maybe they're about to be run over by a motorboat. Isn't it better to, for safety's sake, clear out?
Yeah. Another case we see this is it could be a race committee boat trying to reset a mark and all of a sudden becomes that obstruction. So we've seen that scenario as well. Okay, I'm going to go through these. So just to recap, Rule 20, room to tack in an obstruction. There's required hail. So it emphasizes in the actual rule the importance of communicating between the two boats. The controlling boat does have the option to tack out with the other boat or say you tack and then they can still tack or go ahead and cross behind them. Pretty common scenario. So a couple of thoughts on tactics here that we put in the tool. Rule 20 is a very powerful tool, but it has to be used carefully because you're dealing with an obstruction, which implies if something goes wrong here, bad things could happen, right? Could be a collision, even worse. So it's very dependent on these hails, and many times the hails aren't heard, or they're not heard clearly, or they're misunderstood. So our caution on this one would be, it can be a powerful rule, but use it carefully, and always have a plan B if you're the controlling boat, because if the other boat doesn't hear your hails correctly, you can find yourself in a really bad situation really fast. So you have to anticipate, even if you're the right-of-way boat here, and a plan B is always a good idea. Okay, now we're going to talk section D, and we're going to cover some other rules. I'll do maybe the first one and then hand it off.
Can I ask a really quick question?
Yes.
So if you were heading into an obstruction and there's overlap happening,
Yes.
and I'm going to run into one of those floating piers, for example,
Yes.
and I say tacking, but they think I can just keep running a little further. Now, how long do they have to give me before I yell tacking before they need to let me go?
Well, when you hail for room at the obstruction, they're required to either give you the room right then and there, or hail you tack. So in other words, they're forcing the issue. But that's why they're required to make that hail.
But at that moment they say you tack, you're required to tack at that moment.
Correct. You can't keep sailing. Yep. Yeah. Once they say you tack, you need to tack. You cannot just tactically keep sailing and then tack when you feel like it. That's a great point. Yeah. So let's just talk about some of these other rules. They cover exoneration. What does that mean? Starting errors. How to deal with capsized or anchored boats. Interfering with another boat. So we'll go through these fairly quickly. First, exoneration. The concept is pretty simple. When a boat's sailing within room or mark room to which she's entitled, she'll be exonerated if in an incident with a boat required to give her room or that mark room. So what is that really saying? What it's saying is if you have mark room and you run over the buoy because the other boat didn't give you mark room, that's okay. You're exonerated. Because you were in the right and the other boat didn't give you the room you were entitled to. Okay? So fundamentally, it has to do with, if the other boat breaks 15 or 16, or in the example I just used, if you're compelled to break 31, which is running over the buoy essentially. So really what it comes down to is when you're rounding a mark, you can turn as fast as you want, and the basic right-of-way rules turn off. As we talked about in 18 in mark room, you could turn as fast as you want. You can't turn above your proper or your close hauled course. So proper course doesn't apply, and you can't luff head to wind around that leeward mark. So you can't shut the door in a leeward mark scenario, as we talked about previously. Make sense? Okay. Starting errors and taking penalties. This has to do with a boat that's over the line early, basically. And what it says very simply is if that boat is over early and it's sailing back to start properly, it needs to keep clear of the other boats racing. Okay. So anytime a boat is taking a penalty, it has to keep clear of other boats that are not taking a penalty. So if you need to do some circles, you can't just do those circles in the middle of the rest of the fleet and follow people. You actually have to very quickly move off to the side and do your circles there. A boat moving astern sideways or sideways to windward through the water by backing a sail shall keep clear of one that is not starting line, right? A lot of times boats might be sitting still. So if you're over early, you need to keep clear of boats that are still sailing upwind. If you're doing penalty turns, you need to keep clear. And if you're backing your sail, not just drifting backwards, but actually backing your sail, for example, on the starting line, to either slow down or stop completely, you have to keep clear of boats that aren't backing their sail. And I'll do one more and then I'll pass the baton, John. This has to do with capsized anchored boats. We tend to see more capsized boats than anchored boats on our race courses. So if possible, You shall avoid a boat that's capsized or has not regained control after capsizing, or is trying to help a person or vessel in danger. And then it defines what capsize means. So what this says is when we have windy days and boats start capsizing, we have a duty per the rules to avoid those boats to the extent that it's possible. And also to avoid safety boats that may be coming in to help them. So it's really a good idea to anticipate and make sure that you give them plenty of room. You don't want to cut that too close.